Alara felt the winter in her teeth before the first frost ever kissed the prairie grass. It was a different kind of cold this year, a premonition that rode the wind and settled deep in the marrow of the land. The old-timers, men whose faces were maps of past droughts and blizzards, called it a wolf winter. A winter with teeth, they'd say, a winter that would hunt the weak. And in the Dakota Territory of 1887, Alara was, by every measure, the weakest. She was a widow at 22. Her husband, Liam, a man whose quiet strength had been her only bulwark against this hard country, was gone. A falling tree, a moment of carelessness, a shallow grave on a windswept hill. That was the end of his story and the beginning of her isolation. She was left with a hastily built cabin on a quarter section of marginal land that was more rock than soil. The cabin itself was a testament to their hopeful, foolish haste. It was built of green pine, the logs already shrinking and twisting, opening thin cracks for the wind to sing its mournful song. The conventional wisdom of the territory was clear, and it was loud. It was preached from the pulpit by Reverend Miller, enforced by the land agent Mr. Thorne, and embodied by the master builder Mr. Silas Blackwood. The wisdom was this: a man's strength stacked high. A proper house was a fortress of thick squared logs, chinked tight with moss and mud. Its heart was a great black cast-iron stove, a roaring beast that devoured cords of oak and radiated a blistering immediate heat. To survive a Dakota winter, you needed a mountain of wood and a fire hot enough to challenge the sun. You built upon the earth, conquering it, holding the cold at bay with a wall of fire. This wisdom was the bedrock of their small, burgeoning community. It was a faith as solid as the frozen soil itself, and it was a faith Alara could not afford. Her woodpile was a pathetic mound of cottonwood and pine, scavenged from the creek bed. It would not last a month in a proper stove, and her own stove was a small, cheap thing, prone to fits of smoke and reluctant to draw. The cabin was a sieve. The wind was a constant, unwelcome guest. She was a woman alone, with dwindling supplies and a wolf winter at the door. The sentence came on a Tuesday in late October. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind had a sharp, surgical edge. 3 men on horseback rode up to her small cabin, Blackwood, Thorne, and Miller. They dismounted, their very presence seeming to diminish her small home, to press it further into the dirt. Mr. Thorne, the land agent, spoke first. He was a man whose softness was a kind of weapon. "Mistress Alara," he began, his voice dripping with a practiced paternalistic sympathy, "we have come out of concern. A woman alone. This land is unforgiving." He gestured vaguely at her insufficient woodpile, at the crooked line of her cabin's roof. "This structure will not see you through to April. It is a simple fact." Mr. Silas Blackwood, a man built like the houses he made, snorted. He ran a hand over the logs of her cabin, his touch a gesture of pure contempt. "Green pine," he declared, to no one in particular. "Shrinking. The chinking's already failed. You could throw a cat through the gaps by Christmas." He kicked at the foundation stone. "Liam was a good worker, but he was no builder. This is a temporary shelter at best, a coffin at worst." Reverend Miller stepped forward, his face a mask of pious gravity. "The Lord provides, my child, but he expects us to act with prudence. It is not a woman's place to battle such elements alone. It is prideful. It is folly." He looked at her, his eyes offering not comfort, but judgment. "There is a position for a laundress at the boarding house in town. Mr. Thorne has a standing offer for this land, a modest one, but fair considering." The offer was $5 an acre for land they had bled for. It was an insult wrapped in concern. They were not here to help her. They were vultures, circling and waiting for her to fail. They were here to formalize her doom, to pronounce her situation hopeless, and offer her the only solution their limited imaginations could conjure: surrender. Sell her home, abandon her husband's dream, and retreat into the cramped prescribed role of a dependent woman. Alara stood before them, a slight figure in a worn wool dress, her hands raw from splitting the little wood she had. She felt the weight of their certainty, the crushing consensus of their expertise. They saw a fragile widow. They saw a failing homestead. They saw an easy acquisition and a problem that could be neatly solved by her removal. "I will see the winter through," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. It was a statement of fact, not a plea. Blackwood almost laughed. "With what? Hope? You'll burn every stick you own by mid-November, and then you'll start on the furniture. We've all seen it before." "This land requires a man's hand, Mistress Alara," Thorne added, his tone sharpening slightly, the sympathy curdling into impatience. "We are offering you a respectable way out. Do not be foolish." But Alara had already turned inward, away from their suffocating pronouncements. Their visit had not broken her spirit, it had merely confirmed her isolation. They saw only one way to live, one way to survive, and they had sentenced her to death for being unable to walk their path. They mounted their horses, their backs rigid with the righteousness of their judgment, and rode away, leaving her alone with the wind and the coming dark. She did not weep. She did not rail against the injustice of it. The cold clarity of her situation had burned away all sentiment. They were right about one thing. The cabin would not save her. The stove would not save her. Her woodpile was a joke. Following their wisdom, the wisdom of men who fought the cold head-on, was a guaranteed death. So she would have to find another way. That night, a deep penetrating cold seeped into the cabin. Alara lay under every blanket she owned, her breath pluming in the air. The fire in the small stove had died, and the chill from the floorboards felt like it was trying to reclaim her, to pull her down into the frozen earth. It was in this moment of shivering despair that a memory surfaced, a story Liam had told her once about his grandmother, Anya. She had come from the old country, from the vast windswept steppes of Ukraine, from a land where the winters were not just seasons, but white, howling monsters that devoured the unprepared. He had spoken of her home there, not a log cabin that stood against the wind, but something else entirely, something that hid from it. The next morning, driven by a flicker of an idea so strange it felt like madness, Alara went to the small wooden chest that held Liam's few possessions. Beneath his spare shirt and a worn book of Psalms, she found it. A small, leather-bound journal. It was filled with his grandmother's hand. The script was Cyrillic, a language Alara could not read, but the pages were also filled with detailed, meticulous drawings. They were engineering sketches, rendered with a farmer's practical hand. Page after page showed not a house that fought the winter, but one that made peace with it. It was a zemlyanka, an earth shelter. The drawings showed a structure built down, not up, a home dug into the ground, using the planet itself as the ultimate insulation. She saw cross-sections of deep earthen walls, roofs covered in a thick layer of sod, and small, deep-set windows that peered out at the world from a place of safety. The earth, which her neighbors saw as the very source of the cold, was here presented as a warm, stable blanket. Liam had told her that below the frost line, the ground holds a constant temperature, a quiet, steady warmth drawn from the heart of the world. It was a temperature that felt cool in summer, but blessedly warm in the depths of winter. Anya's journal was a blueprint for harnessing that simple, profound truth. But the heart of the journal, the focus of dozens of drawings, was the stove. It was not the thin-walled, a fast-burning iron box her neighbors revered. It was a pesh, a massive, intricate structure of clay, sand, and stone. It was a thermal battery. The diagrams showed a labyrinthine series of channels, a serpentine flue that snaked back and forth through the core of the masonry. The purpose was clear: to extract every last calorie of heat from the smoke before it was allowed to escape. The fire itself was meant to be small and brief, a single hot burn for an hour or two, but the heat from that fire would be soaked up by the tons of clay and stone, and then it would radiate out slowly, gently, for the next 24 hours. The drawings showed a flat, warm surface for sleeping built right into the side of the masonry. It showed a niche for cooking, another for drying clothes. The petch wasn't just a heater, it was the living, tea-breathing heart of the home. Alara stared at the drawings, at the strange words she couldn't read but whose meaning she could feel. This was not the wisdom of loud, confident men. This was the quiet, patient, time-tested wisdom of grandmothers. It was the knowledge of people who had learned not to shout at the storm, but to bow their heads and let it pass over them. She had no money, She had no help. She had only her own 2 hands, a shovel, a pickaxe, and a rapidly dwindling window of time. She began that very day. Her plan was audacious, born of sheer desperation. She would not abandon the cabin. She would go under it. She pried up the rough-hewn floorboards in the center of the single room, exposing the dark, cold earth beneath. This was the spot. She took Liam's shovel and drove it into the ground. The first shovelful was a shock of cold, damp soil. It felt like digging her own grave, just as Blackwood had predicted. But then she remembered the drawings, the promise of the stable warmth that lay just a few feet below. The labor was a thing of brutal, mind-numbing simplicity. Dig, lift, haul, dump, repeat. She filled a bucket with earth, her arms straining at the weight, and carried it outside. She established a rhythm, a grim choreography of survival. The pile of dark earth beside her cabin grew, a testament to her strange, silent industry. At the end of the first day, her back was a knot of fire, her hands were blistered and raw, and she had excavated a hole barely large enough for a coffin. The mockery began on the 3rd day. 2 farmers on their way to town reined in their horses, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. "What is it you're doing there, Mistress Alara?" one of them called out. "Improving my foundation," she replied, not breaking her rhythm. They exchanged a look. One of them chuckled. "Looks more like you're digging a root cellar, a mighty big one." They rode off, shaking their heads, and by that evening the story was all over town. The mad widow was digging a hole in the floor of her cabin. Mr. Blackwood himself came to see the spectacle a week later. He did not dismount, but sat high on his horse, looking down at her as she worked in the deepening pit. The hole was now 5 feet deep and growing wider by the day. The pile of earth outside was a small hill. "Woman, have you lost your senses?" he boomed, his voice carrying easily on the cold, thin air. "The cold comes from the ground. Every fool knows that. You're building yourself an icebox. You'll be encased in frost before the first real snow." Alara paused, leaning on her shovel, and looked up at him. The pit was now deep enough that only her head and shoulders were visible. "The frost only goes so deep," she said, her voice flat. "Below that, the earth is warm." Blackwood threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Warm? You call 50 degrees warm when it's 30 below outside? It will suck the life right out of you. This is woman's folly of the highest order." He turned his horse. "Don't come crying to us when you're freezing in your own burrow." The name stuck. From that day on, her home was known as Alara's Burrow, or the Widow's Folly. The laughter followed her, a constant, invisible companion. But the laughter could not stop her. She was fueled by something more potent than pride, the cold, hard calculus of survival. Their way was death. This strange, back-breaking path was the only one that offered even a sliver of a chance. She dug until the walls of the pit were well over her head. She had created a room beneath her room, a space roughly 10 feet by 12. The air down there was different. The howling wind was gone, replaced by a profound subterranean silence. And Blackwood had been wrong. The earthen walls did not radiate cold. They radiated a neutral, cellar-like stillness. It was not warm, not yet, but it was stable. It was a baseline from which warmth could be built. Now came the harder part. Following Anya's sketches, she began to build the petch. She hauled dozens of large, smooth stones from the creek bed, her wheelbarrow groaning under the strain. But she spent days mixing clay, sand, and straw with her bare feet, the cold mud squelching between her toes until it was the right consistency. She was not a mason, but the drawings were her guide. She laid the foundation of stones, then began to build the complex inner channels, the heat-exchange labyrinth that was the stove's secret. It was slow, painstaking work. Each layer of the clay and straw mixture had to partially dry before the next could be applied. She built the firebox small and efficient. She carefully constructed the serpentine flue, checking the drawings again and again. As the structure grew, it began to dominate the subterranean room. It was a hulking, organic thing, a clay beast crouched in the center of her burrow. It looked ancient, primal. While the petch cured, she turned her attention to the walls. She plastered them with a thick layer of her clay-straw mixture, creating a smooth, insulated surface that sealed out the dampness. She shored up the earthen walls with timber, scavenged from a collapsed section of fence line. She built a sturdy ladder to get from the cabin level down into the burrow. She relaid the floorboards, leaving a large open section in the middle, creating a loft-like space in the original cabin and a high ceiling for the room below. Finally, she cut a small, low hole for a chimney pipe to vent from the top of the petch up through the cabin's roof. The first fire was a moment of supreme terror and hope. The first snow of the season was falling outside, fat, wet flakes that were a prelude to the coming bitterness. She had a small pile of dry wood she had saved specifically for this purpose. With a trembling hand, she lit a small hot fire in the firebox. At first, the clay beast smoked, a sluggish plume filling the burrow. She thought with a sinking heart that Blackwood had been right. It was all a folly. But then, as the internal flue heated up, a draft took hold. The smoke cleared, sucked up into the winding channels. She let the fire burn hot and fast for an hour, feeding it her precious hardwood, then shut the insulated door to the firebox and the chimney damper, trapping the heat and the hot gases inside the stove's massive body. And then she waited. The outside of the petch remained cool to the touch for hours. Doubt gnawed at her. But as evening fell, a subtle change began. A deep, penetrating warmth began to radiate from the clay. It was not the aggressive, scorching heat of an iron stove. It was a gentle, pervasive presence. It was like the warmth of a sleeping animal. It filled the subterranean space, warming the clay walls, the air, her very bones. She laid a hand on the sleeping platform built into its side. It was as warm as a sun-baked rock. That night, for the first time in months, Ilara slept without shivering. She slept in the gentle, steady embrace of the earth and the slow, breathing fire, while the snow fell silently on the world above. The wolf winter arrived in January. It did not creep in. It exploded across the plains. The old-timers had understated it. This was no wolf. This was a monster. A blizzard of unimaginable fury descended from the north, a moving wall of white that erased the world. It would later be known as the schoolchildren's blizzard. A storm so sudden and so violent it caught hundreds out in the open and froze them where they stood. The temperature plummeted to 40, 50, 60 degrees below zero with the wind chill. The wind was not a sound. It was a physical force, a constant, violent pressure that screamed and clawed at any structure that dared to stand in its way. The snow was not snow. It was a blinding, suffocating torrent of fine, sharp ice crystals. In the town and the surrounding homesteads, the conventional wisdom began to fail. The proud log cabins, the fortresses built by men like Silas Blackwood, became torture chambers. The wind, with its 1,000 tiny fingers, found every crack in the chinking. It forced its way through the floorboards, around the window frames, down the chimneys, the great iron stoves, the hearts of these homes. These became insatiable tyrants. They had to be fed constantly, roaring at full blast just to create a small circle of survivable heat. The blistering warmth they produced was immediately sucked away by the cold infiltrating from all sides. Families huddled close, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their backs freezing while their faces were scorched. Wood piles that were meant to last for months vanished in days. The cabins were consuming their own lifeblood, burning through their fuel at a suicidal rate. The cold was winning. Silas Blackwood sat in his own masterpiece, the largest, proudest cabin in the county. It was a monument to his skill, with massive, perfectly joined logs and a stove that was the envy of all. And he was freezing. His wife and 2 small children were huddled by the stove, their faces pale and pinched. But he had already burned a quarter of his winter wood in 3 days. The wind howled through the walls as if they were made of cheesecloth. The floor was a sheet of ice. His certainty, the bedrock of his entire life, was cracking. His methods, the methods he had preached with such arrogance, were useless against this white monster. His hands, the hands of a master builder, were clumsy with cold. He felt a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion creeping into his heart, doubt. And with the doubt came a thought, an image he had ridiculed. The image of a lone woman digging a hole in the ground, the mad widow's folly. A morbid, desperate curiosity seized him. Was she dead? Had she frozen solid in her foolish burrow? A grim lesson in humility? He had to know. It was an irrational urge, a need to see the ultimate proof of his own wisdom. even as that wisdom was failing him so catastrophically. "I'm going out," he said to his wife. "Silas, no! You'll die!" she cried, her voice thin with fear. "I'm going to the widow's place. I'll not be long." He didn't know why he said it. He didn't know what he was looking for. Validation? A final grim chuckle at her expense? He didn't know. He just had to go. He wrapped himself in a greatcoat, a scarf over his face, and plunged into the storm. The world outside was not a world at all. It was a chaotic, roaring whiteness. The wind knocked him to his knees. He could not see 10 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by the feel of the land beneath his feet, fighting for every step. The journey, which would normally take 15 minutes, took him nearly an hour. His beard froze solid. His lungs burned with every breath. But he was fighting for his life, driven by an impulse he could not name. He stumbled upon her cabin more by accident than by navigation. It was half buried in a massive drift, a small, dark shape in the maelstrom. It looked dead, abandoned. There was no smoke from the chimney. No, wait. He squinted, his eyelashes thick with ice. There was something. Not a plume of smoke, but a thin, lazy wisp, a mere suggestion of warmth, almost invisible against the gray sky. It was impossibly, maddeningly calm. He floundered through the snow to the door and pounded on it with a frozen fist. He expected no answer. He was about to turn away, to fight his way back home, when he heard a bar being lifted from inside. The door swung open. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not a blast of heat. It was a wave of gentle, stable, life-giving warmth. It wrapped around him like a blanket. The second thing was the light, a calm, steady lantern glow. And the third was the smell, the rich, impossible smell of baking bread. He stared, dumbfounded. Alara stood before him. She was not bundled in furs. She was wearing a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up. Her face was calm. Her hair was slightly damp from the humidity in the air. Behind her, he could see the ladder leading down into the burrow. From that space below rose a quality of comfort so profound it seemed to defy the laws of nature. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even, "you are nearly frozen. Come in." He stumbled inside out of the screaming wind. She closed the door, and the world went silent. The storm was gone. Its rage was a distant, muffled thing, a story being told somewhere far away. But he looked down into the burrow. He saw the source of the warmth, the massive clay stove. It glowed with a soft internal life. The air was a steady, comfortable temperature. He would later learn it was 68 degrees. It was humid, breathable, alive. Alara went to the side of the petch, to a small niche hewn into the clay. She pulled out a small, perfectly browned loaf of bread. She sliced a piece and held it out to him. He took it. His hand was shaking, not from cold, but from shock. The bread was warm. He ate it. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He, Silas Blackwood, master builder, pillar of the community, stood in a hole in the ground, eating the bread of the mad widow, while a blizzard that was killing his neighbors raged harmlessly above their heads. The sheer, disorienting force of the revelation struck him dumb. Everything he knew was wrong. He looked at her quiet competence, at the impossible sanctuary she had built. His arrogance, his pride, his lifetime of certainty, all of it crumbled to dust in that moment. "My family," he croaked, his voice raw. "My children, we are freezing. Our wood is almost gone." It was a confession, an admission of total, abject failure. Alara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not a fragile widow, but a woman of immense, unshakable strength. She simply nodded. "Bring them." Somehow he made the journey back. He did not feel the cold. He was insulated by the fire of his own shame and a burgeoning, desperate hope. He burst into his own freezing cabin. "We're leaving," he told his wife. "Oh, we're going to Alara's." He bundled his shivering children and his terrified wife and led them back into the storm, following the lifeline he had tied to his own porch. When they stumbled back into Alara's cabin, she led them down the ladder into the burrow. Blackwood's wife gasped as the warmth enveloped her. The children, who had been whimpering with cold, fell silent, their eyes wide. Alara gave them warm milk and bread and settled them on blankets on the far side of the warm earthen room. They were not the last to arrive. The desperate find their own ways of communicating. Perhaps it was the strange, steady wisp of smoke from her chimney, a beacon of impossible survival in the storm. An hour later, a pounding came at the door. It was Reverend Miller, his face a mask of frost and terror, carrying his wife, who was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow, her skin a deathly pale. Ilara took her from him, laid her on the sleeping platform of the peche, and began to chafe her hands and feet, forcing warm tea between her lips. Miller collapsed near the ladder, his faith in a God who rewarded prudence utterly shattered. He had done everything right. He had the best cabin, the biggest woodpile, and he had been brought to his knees, forced to seek salvation in the very folly he had condemned. Before midnight, the last arrival came. Mr. Thorne, the land agent. His arrogance was gone, stripped away by the brutal, indifferent cold. He had set out for the town and been turned back by the storm, his horse lost. He had seen the faint light in Ilara's window and crawled the last 100 yards on his hands and knees. He did not speak, but merely huddled in a corner, or broken. And so Ilara's burrow became an ark. Crowded into the small, warm space were the very men who had mocked her, who had sentenced her to death. They sat in humbled silence, listening to the gentle hiss of the baking bread and the radiant silence of the peche. They listened to the storm howl and tear at the little cabin above. But down in the earth, they were safe. They were warm. They were alive. In the quiet of that long, storm-tossed night, Silas Blackwood finally found his voice. He looked across the small room at Ilara, who was checking on his sleeping children. "How?" he whispered. The word was a universe of questions. "How did you know? How did you do this? How could we have been so wrong?" Ilara did not look at him. She simply ran a hand over the warm clay of the stove. "My husband's grandmother," she said softly. "She came from a place where the winter is a lesson. You do not fight the lesson. You learn it." She finally turned to face him, her eyes clear and calm. "You built to fight the world, Mr. Blackwood. You built walls to stand against the wind and fires to drive back the cold." She gestured around the small, encompassing room. "This place does not fight. It yields. It nestles into the one thing that is stronger than the wind, the one thing that holds its warmth forever. It makes peace with the world." He looked at his own hands, the calloused, capable hands of a man who built things. For the first time, he realized he had only ever learned how to build one kind of thing. He had built monuments to pride. She had built a home. "We were fools," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Ma puffed up with pride and ignorance." He looked at Miller and Thorne, who both met his gaze and nodded, their faces etched with the same bitter understanding. "We were fools." When the great blizzard finally broke 3 days later, the world was a changed place. It was a world of profound, glittering silence, buried under a dozen feet of snow. The toll was horrific. The news that trickled in over the following weeks was of entire families found frozen in their homes, of ranchers lost in the whiteout, of children who never made it home from school. But from Ilara's burrow, everyone emerged, blinking in the bright, cold sun. They were alive. The story of their survival spread faster than the spring thaw. Ilara was no longer the mad widow. She became something else. They called her the woman of the earth, the burrow wife. The names were spoken with a new kind of respect, a deep and abiding awe. Her folly had become their salvation. Mr. Thorne, his face still gaunt from the ordeal, came to her homestead a month later. He did not ask her to sell. He held out a piece of paper. It was the deed to her land, marked "Paid in Full." "Your debt is cleared," he said, unable to meet her eyes. There is no price for what you did." But the greatest change was in Silas Blackwood. The storm had broken not his body, but his pride, which was far more essential to him. He came to her in the spring as the first green shoots were pushing through the mud. He was not alone. Behind him stood a dozen men from the surrounding homesteads, their hats in their hands. They were farmers, ranchers. It was the backbone of the community. Blackwood did not command or suggest. He asked, "Mistress Ilara," he began, his voice humbled and quiet, "we ask you to teach us. We have spent our lives fighting this land. We see now that we have been fighting the wrong way. Teach us how to make peace. Alara went into her cabin and returned with Anya's leather-bound journal. She opened it on a tree stump, its pages filled with elegant script and practical drawings. She did not teach them with words of triumph or recrimination. She taught them with the quiet authority of proven truth. She explained the concept of thermal mass, how the great slow mass of the earth could be a reservoir of stable temperature. She showed them the drawings of the Petch, explaining how the winding flue was a design for thrift, not for show. She taught them how to mix the clay and the straw, how to read the land, how to find the right spot to dig, how to align a home to catch the low winter sun. That summer became known as the Summer of Digging. All across the territory, a strange and wonderful transformation took place. Men who had spent their lives building up began to build down. Under Alara's and now Blackwood's guidance, existing cabins were retrofitted with Alara's cellars, warm, subterranean living spaces dug out beneath them. New homesteads were designed from the start to be partially buried, their sod roofs blending into the prairie. Silas Blackwood, the master builder, became her most devoted student. He did not just build the new homes, he preached their gospel. He spoke of the foolishness of fighting the cold with fire alone, and of the profound wisdom of letting the earth be your blanket. He, who had once laughed the loudest at her folly, now became the staunchest defender of her knowledge. Years passed, the community thrived, the wolf winters still came, but they were no longer a terror. They were simply a season, a time for hunkering down in the warm, quiet embrace of the earth. The houses of the valley were known for their comfort, their efficiency. The sight of a thin, lazy wisp of smoke from a chimney on the coldest day was no longer a sign of poverty, but a sign of wisdom. The ugly iron stoves were gradually relegated to barns and smokehouses, replaced by the massive radiant hearths of the Petch. Alara never remarried. She did not need to. She became the matriarch of the entire community, its quiet, unshakable center. She was the keeper of the old ways, the woman who had listened to the whispers of a grandmother from a distant land and, in doing so, had saved them all. Her burrow was a landmark, a place of pilgrimage for newcomers seeking to understand how to live in this beautiful, brutal country. Decades later, an old woman sat on a simple wooden bench, a thick shawl around her shoulders, watching her great-grandson play in the last light of an autumn day. The air was crisp, holding the promise of the coming cold. The boy ran to her, his cheeks red. "Grandma Alara," he said, looking at the strange, half-buried house he had lived in his whole life, "why is our house in the ground? All the pictures of houses in my schoolbook, they stand up tall." Alara smiled, a slow, deep smile that held the memory of 100 winters. She pulled the boy close, wrapping him in the warmth of her shawl. "Because, my child," she said, her voice as soft as the prairie wind, "the tallest trees are the first to break in a storm. The wisest creatures know when to seek shelter. We don't stand against the winter here. We sleep in its arms, safe and warm, until it is past." She looked out over the valley, at the dozens of homes nestled into the landscape, their sod roofs greening in the fading light. They were a testament not to a victory, but to a truce, a legacy of humility, written in earth and clay. A forgotten wisdom rediscovered in the heart of the cruelest storm by a lone woman who had been brave enough to dig for her own salvation.